Today at the National Press Club, Minister for Defence Industry and International Development Pat Conroy. He will discuss how the federal government has adapted Australia's defence strategy amid multiple international conflicts. Pat Conroy with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Andrew Tillett. I'm the Defence and Foreign Affairs correspondent for the Australian Financial Review newspaper and also Vice President here at the club. Our guest today is Minister for Defence Industry and Capability Delivery, Pat Conroy, who also wears a second hat as the Minister for International Development and Pacific, putting him squarely at the heart of decision-making over national security. Pat entered Parliament in 2013 and is currently the member for Shortland, which takes in New South Wales's Lake Macquarie and Central Coast regions. With his defence industry responsibilities, Pat oversees billions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars on spending on new weapons, platforms, systems and military kit for Australia's servicemen and women. He also has the Herculean task of ensuring projects run on time and within budget. As Minister, one of Pat's babies has been developing the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise, or GWEO in defence speak, establishing a homegrown industry for producing rockets, missiles and other munitions and enhancing the Defence Force's long-range strike abilities. This is the focus of today's speech and it's always particularly relevant given the regional arms race being led by China. You can follow today's conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC. And we have lots to talk about, so please, everyone welcome Minister Pat Conroy to the podium.
Thank you, Andrew, for the very kind introduction. And I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land we meet and recognise any other people or families with connections to the lands of the Australian Capital Territory and the region. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have served in Australia's armed forces, and I thank all Australian Defence Force personnel for their service. Senior leaders of the ADF and the Department of Defence, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members and directors of the National Press Club, colleagues and friends. These are troubling times. We are witnessing conflicts in Europe and the Middle East. While these conflicts are unfolding on the other side of the world, they are deeply affecting the lives of Australians and have significant implications for Australia's international interests. In our region, we face the most challenging strategic outlook since the Second World War. In the face of these challenges, it's imperative that national security is a common goal that unites us as a nation. The Albanese government regards safeguarding Australians as its most important responsibility. That is why we're making record investments to deliver the men and women of the Australian Defence Force the capabilities they need to defend our nation and help make our region more secure. It's why we're investing record amounts to grow a sovereign Australian defence industry, including spending more than $22 billion on domestic capability acquisition and sustainment last financial year. Ladies and gentlemen, a government that is serious about defence and national security as we are, that has made deterrence the cornerstone of our defence strategy as we have, a government that is committed to peace, security and stability as we are and always will be, must be a government that is absolutely dedicated to ensuring that the Australian Defence Force has what it needs to protect Australia. The Albanese government has been unwavering in its commitment to keeping Australians safe, reinforced by the Prime Minister's decision to elevate the defence industry portfolio to Cabinet with a focus on capability delivery. Capability delivery is about making capability acquisition decisions faster, properly funding defence to deliver new capabilities and improving procurement and project delivery processes. It means following through on what we announce. And that is the record of the Albanese government. Since coming to office, this government has sped up major defence capability acquisitions. We've brought forward initial delivery dates for priority projects and shortened their overall time to completion. After inheriting close to the oldest naval surface fleet since the Second World War, Labor is more than doubling the Royal Australian Navy's fleet of warships. The first of our new general purpose frigates will be delivered by 2029, 4 years earlier than planned, than the first new warship planned by the former government. Decisions around capability delivery under AUKUS are being made at pace, including delivering conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarines a decade earlier than the former government's plan. The Army's heavy landing craft, large new ships critical to an army being transformed for littoral operations, will be launched 7 years earlier than the former government planned, with the first vessel to be delivered in 2028. The Army will also start receiving its 18 medium landing craft from 2026, 2 years earlier than the former government planned. Delivery of new infantry fighting vehicles for the Army has been accelerated, with the first vehicle now being delivered in 2027 compared to 2029. Under Labor, all 129 new infantry fighting vehicles will be delivered by the time the first vehicle would have been delivered under the Coalition. All of this is supported by an increase of $50 billion in defence funding over the next decade compared to the previous trajectory. That's $50 billion more than the former Coalition government planned to invest in defence when it left office. And it's $50 billion more than Peter Dutton plans to invest in defence. Labor is delivering the funding, making the decisions and accelerating the delivery of capabilities to ensure our Defence Force can keep Australians safe and our region secure. In my address today, I will focus on one of the most critical elements of the Albanese government's policies for boosting Australia's defence capabilities. That is our program for a major uplift in missiles, other guided weapons and explosive ordnance for the Australian Defence Force. Now, ladies and gentlemen, why do we need more missiles? Strategic competition between the United States and China is a primary feature of Australia's security environment. That competition is at its sharpest in our region, the Indo-Pacific. We live in a complex and uncertain world, and to look at missiles as a case in point, these weapons are increasing in numbers, speed, range and precision. Missiles first emerged in modern warfare in the Second World War with the German V1 and V2 rockets. Strategic thinking on missiles developed in the early years of the Cold War. Over the decades, military technology has evolved, especially through precision guidance capabilities. More states now wield them, and they are no longer the sole preserve of states. Analysts believe we are now on the cusp of a new Indo-Pacific missile age. And in addition to the terrible damage missiles can wreak, they can also be used as tools of coercion. In the language of strategy, they are persistent. They pose a threat night and day, regardless of when or whether they are actually launched. The modern missile age is defined by proliferation and by rapid technological advances, often accompanied by a lack of transparency or strategic reassurance. Now, in this world, we have a choice. We can watch and wring our hands, or we can respond. We can make sure Australia can hold an adversary at risk through our northern approaches. We can seek to deter conflict or attempts to coerce Australia by force, and in this way, contribute to regional security. We can work closely with our ally, the United States, and with other key partners in the Indo-Pacific, such as Japan and the Republic of Korea. Partners that share our concerns and are prepared to strengthen cooperation in support of shared interests. The Defence Strategic Review concluded that the rise of this new missile age, crystallised by the proliferation of long-range precision strike weapons, has radically reduced the advantages of Australia's geography. It has removed the comfort of distance and eroded our regional capability edge. In response, the Defence Strategic Review recommended the urgent acquisition of long-range strike capabilities. Long-range strike is critical to deterrence. It enables the Australian Defence Force to hold an adversary's forces at risk at greater distances. In today's strategic environment, this is critical to denying any potential adversary's attempt to project power against Australia through our northern approaches. But there can be protracted lead times for securing these weapons. Global production capacity is limited and cannot surge quickly. Australia has not been manufacturing these weapons. That means we're dependent on imports for these critical national security capabilities. So, as well as acquiring more missiles more rapidly from our partners, we need to build a new Australian weapons manufacturing industry. The Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise, known as GWEO, is our answer to protecting Australia in the missile age. It's a combination of action to grow our national munitions and missile stockpile while building the industrial base to manufacture guided weapons and explosive ordnance in this country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, real progress is being made very quickly, but it came off a very low base. When we came to government, we inherited a budget way short of what was needed. After 9 years in office, all the former government had produced on guided weapons and explosive ordnance were 2 flimsy media releases. Unlike the Coalition, the Albanese government has a fully funded, highly detailed and well-advanced suite of policies. Policies to provide the Australian Defence Force with the missile capabilities it needs to keep our country safe by deterring any conflict before it begins. We've identified long-range strike as an immediate priority in the response to the Defence Strategic Review. We've adopted a defence industry development strategy that commits to developing a sovereign ability to produce, maintain, repair and overhaul select weapons. And we've allocated up to $74 billion of the Defence Integrated Investment Program over the next decade for targeting and long-range strike, missile defence and our new guided weapons and explosive ordnance initiatives. The Albanese government has embarked on the biggest increase in Australian missile capabilities in history. We are increasing the Defence Force's strike capabilities across multiple dimensions. Quantity, more missiles, guided weapons and munitions. Quality, more advanced capabilities. Range, the ability to strike over greater distance, and self-reliance, with local manufacturing underwriting the Defence Force's access to these weapons. Let me spend some time unpacking the government's missile acquisition decisions across each of the armed services. For the Australian Navy, we are acquiring the Naval Strike Missile, one of the most advanced ship-destroying missiles in the world. The Naval Strike Missile can operate as an anti-ship or land strike weapon. We are purchasing more than 200 Tomahawk cruise missiles for the Navy's Hobart-class destroyers and will examine including these missiles in the new Hunter-class frigates. The Tomahawk is a long-range land attack cruise missile with a range of more than 2,500 kilometres. Our new Tomahawk missiles will be in our fleet by the end of the year. Australia will be only the 3rd nation to have them after the United States and the United Kingdom. And they will increase our Navy's maximum weapon range more than tenfold. This will build on our decision in February to create a larger and more lethal surface combatant fleet for the Navy, more than doubling the number of warships compared to the former government's plan. Back in the Dreadnought era, the lethality of warships was determined by their sheer tonnage, their size. Today, the ability to hold an enemy at risk can be measured by the number of missile cells, the launch cells on warships that hold missiles ready for firing, and by the capability of those missiles. Under the Coalition's plans, the Navy's fleet of warships would have had a total of 432 missile cells. Under the Albanese government's plans, we will more than double Navy's lethality, delivering a surface combatant fleet with 880 missile cells. This numerical boost will be accompanied by a boost in the sophistication of our naval missile capabilities. We will have surface combatants armed with the most advanced air and missile defence weapons in the world, with the acquisition of the Standard Missile 2 Block 3C and the Standard Missile 6 announced last week. These are sophisticated medium and long-range surface-to-air missiles which will provide our warships with both offensive and defensive capabilities. And the Albanese government made a decision to accelerate the delivery of the SM-6 missile to the Navy by 4 years, and we have the capability right now in our Hobart-class destroyers. For the Royal Australian Air Force, the government is making significant investments in air-launched strike. We've decided to acquire up to 100 of the new extended-range version of the Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile. These are specialised air-to-ground missiles used to target enemy radar systems with a range of 300 kilometres. They'll be deployed on the Air Force's Growler and Super Hornet aircraft and in future on the Joint Strike Fighter. With the support of our friends in Norway, we have committed to accelerated acquisition of the Joint Strike Missile from next year. The Joint Strike Missile is a medium-range cruise missile, and it's designed to fit into the Joint Strike Fighter's internal weapons bay, preserving the aircraft's stealth characteristics. With a range of more than 275 kilometres, the JSM's low-altitude, sea-skimming flight profile helps at delayed detection and engagement by the target's defence system. This is a concrete example of how the government is building sufficient stocks of guided weapons to hold an adversary at risk. And we're also arming the Air Force with advanced long-range weapons, such as the long-range anti-ship missile, with a range of more than 370 kilometres, and the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, extended range, that can strike highly defended targets of ranges up to 900 kilometres. We're also delivering an army with a greater long-range strike capability. This is a transformational reform that has been embraced by our soldiers, from the Chief of Army down to the newest recruit. To deliver this, we are engaged in the largest recapitalisation of Army's equipment in its history, the largest. The Army's 10th Brigade, to be based in Adelaide, was raised as a Fires Brigade in January this year, capable of precise and long-range strike against land and maritime targets. The government is acquiring new guided multiple-launch rocket system missiles for the Army. These are short-range, precision, surface-to-surface rocket systems. To ensure our Army has the tools it needs, the government has more than doubled the number of high-mobility artillery rocket system launchers being acquired for the Army and brought forward their introduction. HIMARS are land-based, long-range surface-to-surface weapon systems. And we're also planning to acquire the Precision Strike Missile, which will initially have a range of 500 kilometres, with future development taking it out to 1,000 kilometres. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to be serious about missiles, you've also got to be serious about missile defence. That's why the government is developing systems which are integrated across air, land, sea, space and cyber. To do that, we are investing $14 to $18 billion across the decade. We're delivering a joint air battle management system that will integrate air and missile defence capabilities across the ADF to ensure coordinated, timely and accurate responses to threats. The joint air battle management system will be the brains of our air and missile defence. It will bring together current and future missile defence weapons to ensure we can respond effectively from land, sea and air. And this aspect of missile defence is a critical challenge for the future, as we'll need our systems to be able to respond to the potential of ever more complex and multi-threat scenarios. But we're also delivering missile defence right now. Last November, Army conducted the first live fire of the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, successfully knocking a target drone out of the sky at 5,000 feet. Air Force's Joint Strike Fighters and Super Hornets will also contribute to missile defence, as will the acquisition of the SM-2 and SM-6 missiles I mentioned earlier, that will also enhance our current layered air and missile defence, and for the first time, introduce a terminal ballistic missile defence capability. That's a lot of detail and a lot of missile acronyms. We'll test you later. But what does it all add up to? A Navy which will go from a legacy fleet with a maximum weapon range of 200 kilometres to a fleet with a maximum range of over 2,500 kilometres. An Air Force which will go from a current weapon range of over 100 kilometres to having aircraft with weapons able to strike up to 900 kilometres. And an Army transformed from a legacy force with a maximum weapon range of 40 kilometres to a littoral manoeuvre force capable of land and maritime strike to 1,000 kilometres. More missiles across a wider variety of advanced capabilities with longer range, greater stealth and higher sophistication. An Australian Defence Force with greater ability to deter adversaries across longer distances. An Australian Defence Force to meet the strategic challenges of today rather than those of yesterday. An Australian Defence Force better equipped to keep Australians safe. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in a world marked by supply chain disruption and strategic fragility, Australia needs not only to acquire more missiles, to make more at home. Our network of international partners have enabled us to secure capabilities like Tomahawk and LRASM that we would otherwise be unable to acquire. But it's also highlighted the challenges we face. Putin's illegal war against Ukraine is using munitions at an industrial scale. Nearly 7 years of Javelin anti-tank guided missiles were used in the first month of the war. And over 10,000 rounds of 155mm artillery shells were used in a single day last year, equivalent to a full month of European production of these shells. Now, we talk about buying defence capabilities off the shelf, but when it comes to munitions, the global shelves are not being restocked as quickly as we would like. And this has been compounded by supply chain bottlenecks, a lack of production capacity and a shortage of raw materials. There's not much slack in the supply chain and lots of customers are waiting to be served. And that's why we need to make and maintain guided weapons and explosive ordnance in Australia. This will make us more self-reliant and more resistant to coercion. And Australia has the foundations needed for a world-class guided weapons and explosive ordnance manufacturing industry. We can create an industry that will make us more secure while creating skilled jobs for Australian workers. The defence future made in Australia is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to ensure our economic and strategic security at the same time. Now, the former government left a funding drought in the first decade of the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise. The Albanese government has fixed this with an initial $2.5 billion over the forward estimates, an increase of more than $1.5 billion. And in April this year, we committed $16 to $21 billion over the next decade. We've taken decisions that will see manufacture of the guided multiple launch rocket systems commence in Australia next year. This is a hugely important initiative. Producing GMLRS missiles in Australia is a stepping stone towards local production of more advanced long-range strike weapons in the future. Local production that is essential to our sovereignty and our security. And we're ensuring that local manufacturing of guided multiple launch rocket systems will continue over the long term with a permanent factory. Today, I announce that the Albanese government, in partnership with Lockheed Martin Australia, will establish a new Australian weapons manufacturing complex. This new facility will be capable of producing 4,000 GMLRS a year from later in the decade. Ladies and gentlemen, this equates to more than a quarter of current global GMLRS production and more than 10 times current Australian Defence Force demand. We're examining sites across New South Wales and Victoria with site selection to be completed next year. The government will invest an initial $316 million for the new complex. And this will be the first facility outside the United States that will produce GMLRS. It will create 70 skilled manufacturing jobs, and it will be able to manufacture other weapons, including more advanced strike weapons, such as the precision strike missile family. I also announced today that the government will partner with Thales Australia to manufacture 155mm M795 artillery ammunition at the Commonwealth-owned Benalla Munitions facility. This will be the first dedicated facility outside the United States to manufacture this critical artillery round. By 2028, it will produce 15,000 rounds a year, and it will have a capacity to scale up to produce 100,000 rounds a year, supporting 550 jobs. This will allow Australia to make ammunition for export markets, delivering more work for Australian businesses as global demand for this round from trusted partners has outstripped current supply. I'm also pleased to report that we're well advanced in plans to produce naval strike missiles in Australia. In September, I opened Consberg's new South Australian facility, where up to 150 workers will be engaged on defence projects, including assembling launchers for the naval strike missile, using mostly Australian manufactured components. And from 2027, naval strike missiles and joint strike missiles will be made in Australia at a new facility near Newcastle, thanks to our strategic partnership with Consberg. The government has committed $850 million to this facility. And under our current schedule, this will be the first facility outside Norway and only the second facility in the world capable of manufacturing both naval strike missiles and joint strike missiles. This facility will create more than 500 jobs in the construction phase and deliver almost $100 million in economic benefits to the Hunter region. And last month, I announced that the government is investing in a sovereign rocket motor program. The government is seeking options from industry to establish a manufacturing complex that will produce rocket motors for some of the world's most advanced missiles. Rocket motors are a critical component of missiles and most guided weapons. And our initiative to establish local rocket motor production will be backed by an initial investment of $22 million over the next 3 years. This project is expected to begin production by the end of the decade and be capable of manufacturing multiple types of solid rocket motors, starting with the GMLRS rocket motors. These initiatives are underpinned by billions of dollars of investment, supporting thousands of jobs. They will strengthen our national and economic security as part of the government's broader Future Made in Australia agenda. Australia's defence industry and its workforce are crucial partners in our drive to make more munitions at home. But if government expects business to invest and take risks, we need to provide industry with a clear roadmap for the future. That's why I'm releasing the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Plan today. This plan sets out the strategy, program and ambition for guided weapons and explosive ordnance. It delivers clarity and assurance for Australian industry and international partners on opportunities to support our GWEO enterprise. We need skilled Australian workers to manufacture guided weapons and their critical components. We need Australian scientists and researchers to drive innovation in new technologies like loitering munitions and advanced manufacturing processes. And we need Australian education institutions to train the skilled workforce for the defence industry. The former government had zero real commitment to manufacturing missiles and guided weapons in Australia. By contrast, under our plan, by the end of this decade, Australia will have at least 2 guided missile factories, a dedicated rocket motor manufacturing facility, and a facility capable of producing up to 100,000 artillery ammunition rounds a year. We'll start with manufacturing weapons using imported components, as we're doing with Consberg for the naval and joint strike missiles, and with Lockheed Martin Australia for the guided multiple launch rocket systems. Then we'll support Australian companies to manufacture and maintain critical components. And we're turbocharging efforts to help Australian defence industry to enter international guided weapons and explosive ordnance supply chains. Today I announced that through our Australian GWEO plan, the Albanese government has committed $500 million across manufacturing projects to boost Australian supply chain. This will be critical in helping more Australian businesses make more componentry for locally built missiles and in opening up export opportunities. And right now, we have Australian companies already in contract to make and supply components. This year alone, Kongsberg has engaged New South Wales-based company Newpress Group to manufacture and deliver launcher mechanical components for the Naval Strike Missile. Kongsberg has also engaged Victorian-based Style Metal for the NSM's electrical control and cable harness systems. Every Joint Strike Missile has Australian ingenuity inside it, courtesy of passive radio frequency sensors manufactured in Adelaide by BAE Systems Australia. And I'm pleased to announce that there will be a tripling of production of these sensors being supplied to Kongsberg under a new $160 million contract with BAE Systems. This will provide over 1,000 Australian-made sensors for Joint Strike Missiles around the world. Additionally, BAE's contract with the NATO consortium will see a significant increase in Australian components used in the Block 2 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile. And through our strategic partners, we will increase Australian manufactured components. For example, Lockheed Martin has identified more than 40 Australian small to medium enterprises to be part of the GMLAS program and its broader supply chain. Friends, all of the government's efforts in defence and foreign policy have the goal of averting conflict and building a safe, secure and prosperous region. We all wish that acquiring new weapons and munitions was not necessary. But in a world marked by crisis and disorder, a well-equipped military is an essential part of national defence. We must be clear-eyed about the security environment in the Indo-Pacific. We face intensifying strategic competition, rapid military build-up and coercive state behaviour. In this environment, Australia needs credible military capability to support a strategy of deterrence by denial. We must show potential adversaries that hostile acts against Australia would not succeed and could not be sustained if conflict were protracted. We must demonstrate to all countries that the cost of aggression continues to outweigh the benefits. Long-range strike is critical to this strategy of deterrence. It enables the Australian Defence Force to hold an adversary's forces at risk at greater distances. But there are protracted lead times for securing these weapons. Global production capacity is limited and cannot surge quickly. So the time to build stockpiles and Australian industry capability is now. The former government abrogated its most important responsibility of keeping Australians safe. When I took up my ministerial portfolio, I inherited a guided weapons enterprise that was grossly underfunded and a plan that consisted of nothing more than 2 media releases. In only 2.5 years, the Albanese government has turned words into substance, giving the defence of our nation the serious attention it deserves. The results speak for themselves. We're dramatically boosting the Australian Defence Force's strike capabilities, and we're building a whole new Australian manufacturing sector, part of the government's Future Made in Australia agenda, to improve access to these weapons and create jobs into the future. Our approach draws on Australia's proud history as a manufacturing nation. It invests in the nation's future as an innovator and manufacturer, and most importantly of all, it will make Australians safer and more secure. I thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Minister. In your sort of closing there, you talked about the time is now to build up stockpiles. But as you acknowledge in your speech, the Kongsberg factory near Newcastle won't be operational until 2027. The GMLAS factory announced today 2029. Yet strategic planners work around a date of 2027 as when China would be ready to invade Taiwan. That's sort of the deadline that a lot of people sort of are focused on. What do you say to critics and such who'll say that this build-up is not happening quick enough and won't be able to make a difference in a potential conflict with China?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I say that we're both rapidly increasing stocks of weapons and building the industrial capability for the future. I made an announcement last week of a $7 billion acquisition of SM2 and SM6 missiles. Earlier, we made significant announcements around other missile stocks. We've brought forward the acquisition of and deployment of the HIMARS launchers, and we'll be making missiles in this country next year. I wish I could have a time machine and go back to 2019 and 2016 and be the minister driving change, but we don't have that luxury. So what we can do now is drive investment and drive $74 billion, up to $74 billion into equipping the ADF with long-range strike and the weapons they need. And we've taken concerted action to move capabilities forward. Whether it's the general purpose frigates delivered 4 years earlier than the former government's plan, infantry fighting vehicles 2 years earlier, HIMARS earlier, standing up the fires regiment earlier, the landing craft being moved forward 8 years. We're moving as quickly as possible, the submarines being delivered up to 10 years early. These are all moving at pace while building the long-term industrial capacity, because you have to do both, Andrew.
But essentially 2027, would we be, if there is a war, are we going to war with what we've got now, essentially? There'll be maybe some missiles that come, but not in volume, not at scale.
Well, let me give you a couple of examples of where we brought things forward. Under the previous government's plan, the Navy would not have the SM6 anti-ballistic missile capability to the late 2020s. We've brought it forward by 4 years, and we have that capability right now. We're equipping the Anzac-class frigates and the air warfare destroyers with naval strike missiles right now. And there's a misnomer that manufacturing in this country slows things down. Without going into commercial in confidence details, building the factory for naval strike missiles actually gives us faster access to naval strike missiles than if we joined the global production queue for the one other factory in the world in Norway. So this government is moving at speed and putting record resources into defence to do that.
Thank you. We'll go to our media members today, and our first question from the floor from Andrew Green.
Minister, Andrew Green from the ABC. Just last week, I think shortly after you left the United States, the General Dynamics CEO said there that electric boat production of both Columbia-class and Virginia-class submarines would have to slow to deal with a lag in supply chain that's behind construction schedules. Were you briefed about that situation? Are you concerned about some of those signs where the US system may be slowing down instead of increasing production of submarines? And more broadly, we've seen a lot of international commentary recently about one of the main factors of AUKUS being this dispersal of US resources across Australia. Are we seeing a fundamental change in Australia's strategic posture by basing a lot of American assets here without the public debate that you would expect with that kind of move?
Yeah. Thanks for the two questions, Andrew. On the first one, in my recent trip to the United States, the submarine industrial base was obviously a frequent topic of conversation. The US is putting $17 billion into uplifting their submarine industrial base to deal with the supply chain issues, including our contribution of $3 billion. And it is paying off. Progress is being made. For example, I visited an Australian company, Austal's very large shipyard in Alabama, where they're now building modules for the Virginia-class submarine. That's an example of the US dispersing and increasing their supply chain. It's a fact that 70% of the supplies on the critical path come from a sole source. They recognise that they need to broaden it out, and Australia can play a role. Not just Australian companies in the United States, such as Austal's shipyard, but when I was there in April, I announced the first contract for an Australian company, Bisalloy Steel, to start producing steel, not to go into our submarines, but to go into US-made Virginia-class submarines. So that's an example of the combined industrial base ramping up to speed up delivery of these submarines. On your second question, it's very important to say that the long-standing position of Australian governments is that we don't have foreign bases in this country. We have rotations of Allied forces through, such as the Marine Detachment in Darwin and Submarine Rotation Force West in 2027. There's been no change in our position. Our position's articulated in the National Defence Strategy. The cornerstone of Australia's defence is what we do in this country and our alliance with the United States, and nothing has changed there.
Thank you. And just a reminder, please, one question each. Our next question is from Ben Packham.
G'day, Minister. Thanks for your speech. On the 155mm shells contract for Thales, Naia and Rheinmetall already have a forge producing 155mm shells. They're the European variant, not the US variant. They told the government they could adapt their Queensland forge to produce US 155mm ammunition within 12 to 18 months. Why didn't the government go with the faster option? Is it because Naia is a major LNP donor? And have you had a chance to inspect that Queensland facility?
Thanks for the multiple questions there, Ben.
All related.
All related. On the last claim about who Naia donate to, I have no idea who they donate to, and I have no idea about the relationship with anyone in the LNP. That's a question for Peter Dutton to answer rather than me. But what I can assure you is that the decision on the artillery ammunition tender was based on 11 criteria, and it was centred on value for money, risk and speed to capability. And as you said in your question, the forging that they do is not for the M795 artillery ammunition. They produce rounds for Germany, which is great, but those rounds aren't used in Australia on any of our platforms. So whoever won that tender would have been required to invest in new equipment to manufacture those rounds. And the assessment of defence using those 11 criteria was that Thales offered the best value for money, speed to capability and lowest risk. And that is what drives our decisions in this area. Both Naia and Thales are really important parts of the defence industry in this country. I respect and value the over 400 employees who work at Naia, and I respect and value the over 4,000 workers in Australia that work at Thales, doing great work at Thales Bendigo, making Bushmasters, to the work at Mooala and Benalla. So this was a value for money, risk and cost decision. And again, I should emphasise that both tenders were valid, and we'll go through the negotiations process with Thales. And if that doesn't eventuate, we'll look at Naia in that scenario. Both were valid, but Thales offered the best solution.
Did you, just on the invitation that you had to visit that plant, did you ever take them up?
I haven't got up to Maryborough yet, Ben, but the important question is, ministers inspecting facilities is not how we decide tenders. If it is, I and you should be very worried. We have an entire department that makes these decisions in this area, headed by the most senior engineer in the entire Department of Defence, the first 3-star engineer in the Australian Defence Force, and I respect and value their assessment of this rather than decisions being made on who is a political mate of someone else.
Thank you.
Next question from Anna Henderson.
Thank you. Anna Henderson, SBS World News. Minister, have you had the explanation you asked for from China about the intercontinental ballistic missile test in the Pacific in recent times? What was the justification they provided? And will the US interceptors at a price tag of $4.2 billion that you announced last week be able to protect Australia from this threat?
Thank you for that question. I won't go into details of confidential discussions between Australia and other governments. That's not how.
Have you had the explanation? I guess is critical.
Yeah, that's not how the Albanese Labor government conducts itself. We expressed significant concern about that ballistic missile test, particularly its entry into the South Pacific, given the Treaty of Rarotonga that says that the South Pacific should be a nuclear weapons-free zone. The acquisition, the $7 billion acquisition of SM-2 and SM-6 missiles, as you said, gives Australia, for the first time, ballistic missile defence in the terminal entry phase. That's the first time we've ever had that. We've brought that 4 years forward so that we have that capability right now, and it's a very advanced capability. I'm not going to get into scenarios about the effectiveness against other platforms. All I can say is the SM-6 missile is the most advanced air defence missile in the world, and we're only the second country in the world to test fire it, and it's being deployed in the Hobart-class air warfare destroyers right now.
So just without getting into the detail, just a yes or no, did you get the explanation that you sought from China?
Those conversations are ongoing.
Thank you. Next question, Ben Westcott.
Hi, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you so much for your speech today, Minister. Just going to your responsibilities as Minister for the Pacific. About a month before you came to power, there was obviously the announcement that the Solomon Islands had signed a security agreement with China that set off a range of diplomatic action by the US and Australia over the past 2 years under your administration and the Biden administration. Now, we're about a week out from the US election, we're 6 months out from the Australian election probably. Do you believe that the work that you've done, the work that this government has done and the Biden administration has done has been sufficiently bedded down in the Pacific and in the governments of both countries to continue under a potential Trump or Harris administration or under potentially a change of government here?
Well, I'm always hesitant to talk about domestic politics in another country. I've got enough challenges talking about it in Australia. But I will say this, that the US investment in the Pacific, the increased US interest in the Pacific began under President Trump. And in fact, one of the events I had in Washington last week was a cross-partisan roundtable with US think tanks about their engagement in the Pacific. They have strong interest in the Pacific, and I'm confident they will continue under multiple administrations. Whether our huge improvement in relationship with the Pacific continues if there's a change of government, that's a question for the opposition. I think it's challenging. We've repaired relationships in the Pacific through using every tool of statecraft. We are the security partner of choice for every South Pacific nation, and that's a privilege that we take seriously. But you've got to reflect on what the opposition offers. They've got an opposition leader in Peter Dutton that makes jokes about rising sea levels. You've got a Shadow Minister for the Pacific in Michael McCormack who says that Pacific Islanders should be grateful for picking our fruit. You look at their actions this year where they voted against our Pacific engagement visa in the Parliament, which is a critical part of building our people-to-people links in the region through building the diaspora in the Pacific into Australia. So just as I think, and excuse me for being political, but I'm a politician, just as I think that the opposition is weak on national defence because they want to cut $50 billion from the national defence budget. They're weak on national security because they would take our relationships in the Pacific backwards by their actions on climate change, their ridiculous and risky nuclear policy, by their refusal to engage on things like the Pacific engagement visa. And this is a real question mark for the Australian people. At the last election, the Pacific policy was actually a topic of conversation, first time ever in this country that occurred, and that occurred because of the Solomon Islands Security Pact that was allowed to happen under the last coalition government.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next question from David Crowe.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Minister, for your speech. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. I'm Chief Political Correspondent, and so I welcome you being political in your last answer because I'm going to be political in my question. One of the big issues this week is Anthony Albanese and Qantas and the questions over his disclosures about flight upgrades. So there is a proposal or a suggestion from the coalition that this is so bad it should go to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. What's your response to that suggestion that it should go to an independent inquiry by the Anti-Corruption Commission?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, David. And I will simply restate that all declarations by the Prime Minister have been made in accordance with the rules, and that's incredibly important. And that stands in stark contrast to people like Bridget McKenzie, who misled the Australian public about whether she received free upgrades from Qantas. Look, this broader debate I find interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, these are claims made by a former Liberal staffer who, as recently as 3 months ago, was the headline act at federal Liberal fundraisers. Now, I know journalists will say, well, that's on page 1 of the book. Well, the book isn't what people are reading. They're reading people's newspapers and seeing television. And until we reminded people of that, very little of the reporting acknowledged that the person in question was a Liberal Party identity. I think that's a really important point to make. The second point I'd make in this area is judge us by our actions. We're the government, when in 2011 Qantas stood down its workers, that called them out and opposed them for when they grounded their fleet. Where we in opposition attacked Qantas for, again, standing down their workers during COVID. And right now, we're implementing the same job, same pay legislation that will deliver $30,000 pay rises to Qantas labour hire workers who are being discriminated against right now. Who has been on the side of Qantas on all of those battles? Peter Dutton and Bridget McKenzie. They've taken all those upgrades and they've been on the side of Qantas every single step of the journey. And I think real questions have to be asked about that, as well as what Peter Dutton promised in return for those free private flights from Gina Reinhardt.
Thank you. We won't get into the Central Coast property market, given that we're both coasties. Next question from Kim Bergman.
Thank you, Minister, and back to defence. I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine in your talk, because the Army is in the process of retiring 22 Tiger armed reconnaissance helicopters, which I believe to be are in good condition. Ukraine has requested those. So while you work through that process, will you keep those helicopters current, or will you treat them the same way that you treated the Taipan fleet?
Thanks for the question. We're developing the disposal strategy for the Tiger attack helicopters right now. And of course on Ukraine, we're in regular discussions with them about their needs and how we can support them. It was a huge privilege 2 weeks ago to represent Australia at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting, where I announced that we will be gifting our Abrams tank fleet to Ukraine, a $250 million commitment that lifts our military support to $1.3 billion as part of a total $1.5 billion of support. We're proud and privileged to be the largest non-NATO contributor of military support to Ukraine, and we'll continue to talk to them about their needs, but we're working through the disposal strategy right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Rob Scott.
Thanks, Minister. Rob Scott from 7 News. You've said today in your speech that one of the main reasons we need to build up our missile stocks, make them more lethal, have greater strike capability is due to the great power struggle going on in our region between the United States and China. But how much do you think Xi Jinping is actually watching what we're doing here? Do you think he cares? Do you think it'll factor into any of his considerations when he's potentially planning an invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. And I'd invite you to ask someone else that question. Xi Jinping in particular.
Love to try.
All I can talk about is what I'm doing and what the government is doing. And the government's highest responsibility is to keep Australians safe, and that's what we're doing through announcements like today. The way of deterring conflict, the way of promoting peace is by strong deterrence and making it very clear to potential adversaries that the cost of aggression outweighs any particular benefits. And that's why investing in long-range strike is critical, with the added byproduct of thousands of high-skilled Australian jobs being created at the same time. So you'd have to ask other people whether that is factoring into people's considerations. But what I can say to you is that we are providing record investments in the Australian Defence Force at speed to give us the best ADF to help defend the nation.
Thank you.
Xi Jinping, if you're watching, please come and join us anytime. Dominic Gianni is our ex-question.
Minister, thank you. One for your Pacific hat. I'm just wondering, on reports that Australia is seeking a quid pro quo with Papua New Guinea when it comes to China security arrangements, are you able to confirm that? And if you can't, does that risk us becoming what we criticise in China being in the Pacific, namely that an actor signing a non-transparent agreement for conditional cash, rather?
Well, a couple of things. One, we're still negotiating the finer details of support for a national rugby league team from Papua New Guinea. But I can say to you with joy that nothing will bring the two peoples closer together than a national rugby league team from Port Moresby playing in Australia. It is critical to bring the countries together. It's not just about people-to-people links, it's an economic development strategy, and it's also one that is also a vehicle for gender equality. Sport is a great part of that. And we've got a broader sports diplomacy agenda of supporting the Pacific, bringing the peoples together. In terms of what and what isn't in that agreement, I'm not going to talk about that now because we haven't finalised the agreement. I could refer you to statements in the media by Prime Minister Marape that go to this, but what I'll say to you is that part of any agreement is strategic trust. Prime Minister Marape, Foreign Minister Kachenko have repeatedly said, including in Australia, that Australia is their partner of choice, their security partner of choice. And that's an honour and privilege we are honoured to have, and will hopefully continue to be their security partner of choice. And that's part of multiple endeavours to bring our countries closer together.
Sorry, to clarify, will that agreement be released in full?
Again, when we announce, if we announce an agreement, because we're still negotiating it, we will be very transparent about what and what isn't in the agreement. But again, strategic trust is a critical part of any work in the region, and we're really proud to have repaired our relationships with the Pacific.
Thank you.
Jason Katsoukas.
Minister, thanks for your speech. US Congressman Michael McCall told my colleague Ben Packham earlier this year that Australia is now the central base of operations for the US military to deter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Do you agree with that assessment? And would the US be allowed to operate through Australia in the event of a conflict with China?
Well, on the second question, I don't engage in hypotheticals. Just anyone in my position should not be engaging in hypotheticals. On the first part of your question, again, I'll repeat that we do not have foreign bases in this country, and that is the policy of this government. Look, we've been very clear that intensifying geostrategic competition is the dominant theme of our era, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. We are incredibly privileged to have our alliance with the United States and be partners, just as we are with our partnership with like-minded countries such as Japan and the Republic of Korea. And we're working very closely for a free and open Indo-Pacific where international rules are obeyed, where every country has the right to coexist peacefully, where, importantly, sovereignty is respected. But I'm just not going to get into questions about hypotheticals.
You say you don't want to do hypotheticals there, but I mean, the reality is we've made the choice. You know, we're going to have US nuclear-powered submarines operating out of Perth. We've got the Marines in Darwin. We have what they do at Pine Gap, which we're not allowed to be told what they do at Pine Gap. We've made the choice. We can't, if there is a conflict between the US and China, Australia is not going to be singled out, are we?
Again, I refer you to my previous answer, Andrew, and just say again, in all these things, the sovereignty of Australia is paramount. And I refer you to a ministerial statement Deputy Prime Minister Miles made in Parliament early last year, which really gives an outline of our sovereignty. The National Defence Strategy goes into it as well. We are a sovereign nation, and the elected government of the day will make decisions about what we engage in, no one else.
Okay. Next question, Melissa Code.
Thank you, Minister, for your speech. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Many national security experts would be familiar with the term VUCA. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, many things which sort of illuminate the urgency and need to invest in the capability that you announced today. But those things also apply equally to humanitarian capability. And of course, the humanitarian policy was launched earlier this month. They're two sides of the same coin, but they're not always equal when it comes to money and investment. As someone with a portfolio that captures both of those considerations, when you go to bed at night and ask yourself, how do we be a good society? Where have you landed on that equation? And also, the Australian Council for International Development just last week made the point that the $7 billion announcement for Australia's long-range defence missile capability was like the whole year's worth of aid funding for Australia. So can you just share with us where you've sort of fallen philosophically after holding those important things in your portfolio?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And the answer is you have to do both. You have to invest in a strong defence force to deter potential aggression, and you have to invest in a strong development policy and use all tools of statecraft to promote a safe and secure region. And that's why in my conclusion I talked about the single united aim of defence policy and foreign policy, which is to prevent conflict and increase security and stability. I'm proud to be the first International Development and Pacific Minister as a full member of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. I was there from day one in that role. That elevates that portfolio in consideration. I'm also the first Pacific Minister to be a full member of the Cabinet. This is about this government's dual investments in foreign policy and defence policy. We've made the single largest increase in foreign aid in over a decade. We are repairing the damage done under the last government to our overseas development assistance budget, and we are the largest development partner, for example, in the Pacific. So we need to do both, invest in strong defence capabilities and strong development outcomes, and we're doing it. And that's why I love my job, because we need to do both at the same time, and that's what I'm committed to doing.
Would Labor be open to considering the calls to make aid funding 1% of the federal budget part of an election commitment?
Again, a second question, Andrew. Your iron rule is weakening here.
You're answering very quickly.
What I can say is you'll see our foreign aid election policy when we release it. I'm not going to release it in the middle of a speech on missiles at the National Press Club, as much as I love both portfolios.
Thank you.
Got a bit of tension there, I think. Next question, Joseph Albrecht Palmer.
Hi, Minister. Joseph Albrecht Palmer here from Newswire. Thank you for your address. The United States is fitting out their Pacific Fleet, or part of their Pacific Fleet, with Patriot interceptors, basically out of fear of Chinese hypersonic missiles. So looking forward a decade, how will this plan that you're talking about today set us up to deal with that kind of threat in 10 years from now?
Well, thanks for the question. And in my speech, I talked about you need to be equally focused on not just long-range strike, but missile defence. And that's why, as part of our up to $74 billion of investment in this area, we've allocated $14 to $18 billion for missile defence. And you start with the brains of that system, which is the Joint Air Battle Management System that's being established right now, headquartered at RAF Base Williamtown. And then you layer on top of it the defensive effectors for that. It could be NASAMS, which obviously is being deployed right now. It could be our excellent Joint Strike Fighters and Super Hornets. A critical part of it was the announcement I made last week of the acquisition of the SM-2 and SM-6 missiles. As I said, we accelerated the acquisition of the SM-6 missiles by 4 years so that we have that capability in our Hobart-class air warfare destroyers right now. And we'll continue to evaluate the investment priorities for missile defence through the National Defence Strategy and updates to the Integrated Investment Program. But investing up to $18 billion is a huge investment by this government, and bringing forward capabilities like the SM-6 is all about keeping Australians safe, which is our highest priority.
Thank you.
Next question from Nick Stewart.
Thanks very much. You've got a plan to buy missiles, first of all. You've got a plan to manufacture missiles after that. When you look at R&D for missiles, though, there's a couple of pages and a very nice diagram in your program. Are you going to, before the next election, put out a clear plan outlining how you are going to develop actual R&D, research and development here in Australia, so that we can have our own Indigenous missiles rather than simply ones that are manufacturing Lockheed Martin or other big Kongsberg, other big multinationals?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Nicholas. And the answer is the plan is already out there. It's called the Defence Industry Development Strategy. And a key part of the Defence Industry Development Strategy is a $3.5 billion investment in what's called the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator, the single biggest investment in defence innovation in a long, long time. That is about bringing capability forward. It's about speed to capability, and it will look at things like a missile development. But we're already doing lots of work in that area. I announced a $60 million investment in missile R&D with the Defence Science and Technology Group when I announced the rocket motor manufacturing announcement last month. We've already got strong programs of record around hypersonics right now. So we are putting lots of money into that area. We'll continue to do that. Our strategy around manufacturing in this country unambiguously is about a practical way of building up our industrial capability while doing that research and development. So whether it's manufacturing an indigenous hypersonics missile or being part of the Precision Strike Missile Consortium that we go on to building more advanced missiles later on.
Will we see Australian missiles, or will we be working with foreign multinationals?
Well, again, these are Australian missiles. Australian workers are working on them right now. The 4,000 workers at Thales that are working in places like Bendigo and Benalla and Moala are doing things for Australia. The BAE workers in Adelaide are building the parts for the Evolved Sea Sparrow missile and the Joint Strike missile are part of an Australian missile industry. I really want people to focus on this important part. It's where the industrial activity occurs. It's where we have access to the IP. It's where we're investing in a capability that is the critical driver. I'm less focused on what is the brand name of the missile. It's about having the capability in this country and the workers and the skilled industry able to do that. And that's why today's announcement is so significant.
Just finally, you mentioned Thales in that last answer there. That company obviously has a bit of a concern, a corruption cloud at the moment that's before the NAC. Are you confident in Thales and the integrity of that company?
Well, let's be very frank about this thing that's flying around. There's an allegation of an incident that occurred in 2017. 7 years ago, under the last government. Defence has thoroughly investigated it, and I'm advised that there's been no evidence to substantiate the allegation. It's important to note that there is one allegation unsubstantiated. Does that mean that we don't want Bushmasters built in Bendigo to support the Australian Defence Force? Does that mean that we don't want rifles manufactured in the Lithgow Small Arms Factory to equip the Australian Defence Force? This is a really important point floating around, that all allegations like that should be investigated. Evidence should be examined. No evidence has been found. And Thales, like all the Australian defence industry, is an essential part of defending the nation.
Thank you, or as they say in French, merci. Thank you very much for your speech today, and please accept our gift of membership to renew your time with the club. I know it was about 12 months ago since you last speak here, so please everyone join me in thanking Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy.